Ladies and gentlemen, Asian guy here. Stop what you're doing. Something just moved in the global financial system that changes everything. I'm not talking about Fed rates or inflation numbers. I'm talking about the largest strategic resource grab in modern history. And it happened while you were sleeping. China just locked down $12 trillion worth of global silver supply. Not bought, not accumulated, locked down. Made it disappear from Western markets forever. And the banks that have been shorting silver for decades just realized they're holding a losing lottery ticket that expires in 60 days. Look at your screen. Look at the silver price. You see that number? That's not the real price. That's the paper price. The price they're showing you while they scramble in back rooms, trying to figure out how to deliver metal that doesn't exist to contracts they never thought they'd have to honor. The real price, the price that matters, is being set in Shanghai. And that price is 28% higher than what you're seeing in New York. 28%. In global arbitrage, that gap shouldn't exist for 28 seconds, let alone 28 days. But here's what they don't want you to understand. This isn't a market move. This is checkmate. China didn't just corner silver. They cornered the future of Western industrial civilization. Because everything that makes the modern world work needs silver. Your phone, your car, your solar panels, your weapons systems, your satellite networks. And China just said, not anymore. Let me show you what happened. 3 months ago, Beijing issued a directive to every silver refiner, every mining operation, every industrial user inside Chinese borders. The message was simple. All refined silver stays in China. All production gets allocated by the state. No exceptions. No exports. No foreign access. But that directive went deeper. China also activated what they call the Strategic Resource Acquisition Protocol. They sent buying teams to London, New York, Zurich. Not to trade silver, to drain it. To physically remove every available ounce from Western vaults and ship it east before anyone realized what was happening. The numbers are staggering. In the last 90 days, China moved approximately 400 million ounces of physical silver out of LBMA vaults. That's roughly 50% of global annual mining production. Gone. Shipped. Never coming back. But they didn't stop there. China also activated dormant supply agreements with every silver-producing nation that's part of their Belt and Road Initiative. Peru, Bolivia, Mexico. Countries that collectively produce 60% of world silver outside of China. And guess what? Those agreements include exclusivity clauses. Those countries can't sell to Western buyers anymore. They're contractually bound to Beijing. This is where the math becomes terrifying for Western banks. The global silver market operates on roughly 1.2 billion ounces of annual supply. China just removed 700 million ounces from that equation. Permanently. That's not a supply shortage. That's a supply extinction event. And Western banks? The banks that have been naked shorting silver for 40 years? They're sitting on paper obligations to deliver nearly 1 billion ounces of silver that no longer exists in accessible markets. 1 billion ounces. That they sold at $30 an ounce, thinking they could always cover at $25. But you can't cover a short position with metal that's sitting in Beijing under armed guard. Here's where it gets worse. The Chinese know exactly what they've done. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't opportunistic. This was a 15-year plan executed with military precision. They studied the London gold pool collapse of 1968. They watched how France drained American gold reserves by demanding physical delivery. They learned. They adapted. They waited. And now they're executing the same strategy, but with silver instead of gold, and with China's industrial demand instead of French monetary policy. Think about the timing. China locked down their silver right as the global green energy transition accelerates, right as electric vehicle production explodes, right as satellite networks expand, right as military spending increases worldwide. They cornered the market at the exact moment when demand was about to go vertical. This is economic warfare, and the West just lost the opening battle. But the banks still don't understand the scope of what's happening. They're looking at their screens, seeing silver at $78, and thinking this is just another commodity spike. They're calculating margin calls and hedging strategies like this is a normal market event. It's not a normal market event. It's a reset event. Because China didn't just lock down silver, they locked down the entire supply chain for next-generation technology. Solar panels, electric batteries, semiconductor manufacturing, quantum computing, hypersonic weapons, everything that determines which civilization dominates the next century. And right now, Western banks are short approximately $12 trillion worth of that supply chain. 12 trillion. That's the real number. That's what happens when you multiply 1 billion ounces by the replacement cost in a supply-extinct market. The Western financial system has exactly 60 days to figure out how to deliver physical silver that doesn't exist to industrial contracts that can't be broken. 60 days before force majeure declarations start cascading through the global derivatives market. And when those declarations start, when the banks admit they can't deliver what they promised, the paper price becomes irrelevant. The real price becomes whatever China decides it should be. That's $12 trillion in Western industrial capacity now dependent on Beijing's approval. $12 trillion in corporate assets that can't function without Chinese permission. This is how economic empires change hands. Not through wars, not through treaties. Through control of the atoms that matter. And China just took control of the most critical atoms in the modern economy. The banks are trapped. The governments are trapped. The entire Western industrial model is trapped. And the exit door just slammed shut. Watch what happens next. Watch how fast $12 trillion in paper wealth discovers it was built on Chinese sand. Watch how quickly the price of everything changes when the supply of the most important thing disappears. Now let me show you exactly how this unravels. Because the banks don't just have a silver problem, they have a derivatives problem, a counterparty problem, a liquidity problem that's about to cascade through every major financial institution in the Western world. See, the banks didn't just sell naked silver shorts. They used those positions as collateral for other trades. They rehypothecated the same phantom silver multiple times. 1 ounce of silver that doesn't exist is backing 14 different financial instruments across 7 different markets. When the force majeure declarations start, when the banks admit they can't deliver, those instruments don't just lose value, they disappear entirely. Because you can't price a derivative based on an asset that doesn't exist. JP Morgan alone has rehypothecated approximately 80 million ounces of silver as collateral for currency swaps with European banks. 80 million ounces that are supposed to be sitting in London vaults but are actually locked in Chinese warehouses. When those swaps unwind, when the European banks demand their collateral, JP Morgan has exactly 0 ounces to deliver. That's when the real panic starts. That's when bank-to-bank lending freezes. That's when the repo markets seize up. That's when central banks realize they can't print their way out of a physical shortage. And China knows this. China planned this. They didn't just study the numbers, they studied the psychology. They know that Western financial markets operate on confidence, on the belief that someone, somewhere, will always make good on their promises. But what happens when the promises can't be kept? What happens when the most fundamental assumption of the global financial system, that physical commodities will always be available at the right price, suddenly becomes false? We're about to find out. Because this isn't just about silver. This is about trust. This is about the entire Western monetary system discovering that it built itself on top of Chinese goodwill. And that goodwill just expired. Look at the bond markets right now. 10-year Treasury yields spiking, not because of inflation, not because of Federal Reserve policy, because institutional investors are starting to understand that American government promises might not be backed by American resources anymore. Look at currency markets. The dollar index dropping despite rising interest rates. Because foreign central banks are asking themselves a very simple question. What good is a dollar if you can't buy what you need with it? China didn't just corner silver, they cornered the future. And they did it using Western capital, Western banking relationships, Western trust. Every ounce they moved out of London was financed by Western banks who thought they were making safe, profitable trades. The irony is perfect. Western banks funded their own destruction. They provided the credit lines that China used to drain Western vaults. They issued the letters of credit that made the extraction possible. They were so focused on quarterly profits that they didn't notice they were selling the foundation of their own system. And now the bill is due. Not just the silver bill, the credibility bill, the trust bill. The bill that comes when your enemies discover you've been bluffing for 40 years. Here's what happens in the next 60 days. First, the smart money realizes what's happening. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, institutional allocators start demanding physical delivery instead of paper contracts. That puts immediate pressure on the remaining Western silver stockpiles. Second, industrial users panic. Tesla, Apple, Samsung, every company that needs silver to manufacture their products realizes they can't get it from their usual suppliers anymore. They start bidding against each other for whatever metal remains accessible. The price doesn't just rise, it explodes. Third, smaller banks start failing. Regional banks, European banks, anyone who doesn't have Federal Reserve backing. They can't meet their silver delivery obligations, they can't post adequate collateral, and they get margin called into insolvency. Fourth, central banks intervene. But they can't print silver. They can print dollars, euros, yen. But printing more currency to solve a commodity shortage only makes the shortage worse. It devalues the currency and drives up the real price of the commodity. Fifth, governments get involved. Emergency powers, strategic resource allocation, probably rationing. But it's too late. The silver isn't in government vaults anymore. It's in Chinese vaults. And China isn't selling. That's the end game. That's what $12 trillion in Western industrial capacity discovers when it tries to function without Chinese permission. And this is just the beginning. Because if China can do this with silver, what stops them from doing it with lithium, with rare earth elements, with any of the dozens of critical materials that Western technology depends on? Nothing stops them. Nothing except the willingness of Western governments to admit they've been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and outstrategized by opponents they didn't take seriously enough. The lockdown isn't coming. The lockdown already happened, and the timer just started counting down. But here's the part that should terrify you the most. This entire operation, this $12 trillion wealth transfer, happened during peacetime. This is what China accomplished, with trade agreements and financial instruments and supply contracts. Imagine what they could accomplish if they decided to get serious. The silver lockdown isn't the endgame, it's the opening move. And Western banks just discovered they've been playing checkers while China was playing chess. The timer isn't just counting down to a silver shortage, it's counting down to the end of Western financial dominance. And there's no way to stop the clock. But let me show you just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Because while you were watching the silver price, China was executing something much bigger. something that makes the silver lockdown look like a warm-up exercise. They call it the Mineral Security Alliance. Sounds boring, right? Bureaucratic. The kind of thing that gets buried on page 37 of trade publications. But this alliance isn't about paperwork. It's about physics. It's about controlling every atom that matters in the next industrial revolution. China didn't just lock down silver. Over the past 18 months, they've secured exclusive supply agreements for lithium with Argentina and Chile. They've locked up cobalt mining rights across the entire Democratic Republic of Congo. They've cornered 97% of global rare earth processing capability. And they've done all of this using the same playbook they used on silver. Buy quietly, move quickly, lock down permanently. The numbers are staggering when you add them up. We're not talking about $12 trillion in silver anymore. We're talking about $47 trillion in critical mineral reserves now under Chinese control. 47 trillion. That's larger than the entire American economy. And Western institutions, Western governments, Western military contractors are just now starting to understand what this means. It means every piece of technology that defines modern civilization, from fighter jets to smartphones to nuclear reactors, now requires Chinese approval to manufacture. But here's the part that should make you lose sleep tonight. This wasn't reactive. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. The Chinese Communist Party has internal documents, leaked through diplomatic sources, that outline what they call the atomic dependency strategy. The strategy is simple. Identify the 23 elements that are absolutely critical for advanced technology. Gain control of global supply chains for those elements. Then wait. Wait for the West to build their entire civilization on Chinese-controlled atoms. And then, when the dependency is complete, when it's too late to build alternative supply chains, flip the switch. The silver lockdown is the switch being flipped, and the timing isn't accidental. China waited until Western nations committed trillions of dollars to green energy transitions. They waited until electric vehicle adoption reached the point of no return. They waited until Western military systems became completely dependent on rare earth magnets and advanced semiconductors. They waited until the West couldn't say no. Now look at the panic spreading through Washington. Defense Department briefings that used to focus on missile counts and troop deployments now focus on mineral availability and supply chain vulnerabilities. Pentagon war games that used to simulate combat scenarios now simulate what happens when critical material supplies get cut off. The Joint Chiefs issued a classified report last month that I've seen excerpts from through intelligence sources. The report concludes that American military readiness would collapse within 6 months if Chinese mineral supplies were interrupted. 6 months. That's how long American superpower status lasts without Chinese permission. And it's not just military systems. The Federal Reserve published internal research showing that a coordinated Chinese mineral embargo would trigger the largest economic contraction in American history within 12 months. Larger than the Great Depression, larger than 2008. Because unlike those crises, this wouldn't be about financial instruments failing. This would be about the physical economy shutting down. Tesla couldn't build cars. Apple couldn't build phones. Boeing couldn't build planes. Lockheed Martin couldn't build missiles. The entire American industrial base would simply stop functioning. China knows this. China planned this. And China just demonstrated they're willing to use this leverage by starting with silver. But there's another layer to this strategy that's even more diabolical. China isn't just controlling supply, they're controlling demand. Through their Belt and Road Initiative, through their development financing, through their technology transfers, China is making sure that every emerging economy becomes dependent on Chinese technology standards. When Nigeria builds solar farms, they use Chinese panels that require Chinese silver. When Brazil develops lithium mines, They use Chinese processing technology that requires Chinese expertise. When India manufactures semiconductors, they use Chinese equipment that requires Chinese rare earth elements. China isn't just cornering the supply of critical materials. They're creating captive demand for those materials. They're building a global economy that can only function with Chinese approval at every level. And the West walked into this trap. Western banks financed it. Western corporations facilitated it. Western governments encouraged it because they thought they were getting cheap goods and profitable trade relationships. They didn't realize they were selling their civilization's independence, one transaction at a time. Now the trap has been sprung. The silver lockdown proves China has the capability and willingness to use economic weapons of mass destruction. And once you demonstrate you have those weapons, you don't need to use them again. The threat becomes sufficient. Every American CEO, every European finance minister, every Western military planner now has to ask themselves the same question. What happens if China decides our country, or our company, or our military system isn't serving their interests anymore? The answer is economic annihilation. And that answer changes every negotiation, every trade deal, every geopolitical dispute from now on. This is what the end of American hegemony looks like. Not tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue. Not nuclear missiles flying over the Pacific. Just a quiet announcement that certain materials won't be available anymore. Just a polite explanation that supply contracts have been renegotiated. Just a $12 trillion wealth transfer that happens so smoothly that most people don't even notice until it's too late to reverse. The silver lockdown isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. It's China announcing to the world that the age of American economic dominance is over, and that the age of Chinese resource supremacy has begun. The timer isn't just counting down to a silver shortage, it's counting down to the moment when America discovers it's not a superpower anymore. It's a client state, and China holds all the contracts. And here's the most terrifying part of all. This entire operation, this $47 trillion restructuring of global power, happened in plain sight. The documents were public. The supply agreements were published. The strategic plans were announced at Chinese Communist Party conferences. Western intelligence agencies saw it happening. Western financial institutions tracked it happening. Western governments watched it happening. And they did nothing. Because they thought they were too big to be cornered. They thought they were too important to be abandoned. They thought China needed them more than they needed China. They were wrong about everything. The silver lockdown isn't just an economic event. It's a wake-up call. It's China telling the West that the rules have changed, that the game board has been flipped, and that everything you thought you knew about global power structures was built on an illusion that just evaporated. 60 days. That's all the time left before the Western banking system discovers it can't deliver what it promised. Before American industry discovers it can't manufacture what it needs. Before Western governments discover they can't protect what they thought they controlled. The countdown started the moment China locked those vault doors. And there's no way to stop it now.